Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Unstoppable Dad Project. Appreciate you joining me here for another week on the podcast. Before I get into today's topic, I just want to ask you a few favors. As always, please make sure that you are subscribed on whatever podcast platform you are listening to this on: Apple, Spotify, Google. You can find the podcast on all the great podcast platforms. Please make sure you subscribe. That way, you will get notified every time I publish a new episode. And it also helps us get out in front of more people. You can also follow us on the socials. So at The Unstoppable Dad on Instagram, The Unstoppable Dad Project on Facebook, and you'll be able to find some video versions of these podcasts on YouTube. Hopefully more over the coming weeks as I start to get some more edited and uploaded and going on from there. On the Facebook page, we also have a free Facebook group, The Unstoppable Dads. You can jump on there and you'll be able to get notified in that group as well when I drop new episodes and whenever anything around free content, training, health, lifestyle drops in there. So this week, I want to talk about getting injured while training, because it is something that I'm part of a few different training groups. It's health and fitness groups for dads. It's also something that I get asked all the time. And what I mean by, let's give a little bit of context around kind of what I mean with this question and with this answer, and the three things that you probably need to look at if you're consistently getting hurt in training or in the gym. So with being hurt in the gym, being hurt in training, happens a lot where somebody will be like, yep, I constantly injure my back or my shoulders get jacked up. And sometimes they'll put that down to a particular movement that they're doing. Sometimes it will be down to a particular exercise regime, but there's this consistent reoccurring injury that is happening within the person's life that just keeps showing up. And every time they do a particular movement, maybe it aggravates it. Maybe it's almost like clockwork. It happens once every 6 months. And if that's the case, there is probably a few things you need to look at. Firstly, within the program that you're doing, which is kind of what today's podcast is about. And there will be potentially some external factors that you may need to look at as well. Now, when it comes to injury, it's important to understand the difference between a contact and non-contact injury, or things that could be prevented and things that probably can't be prevented. So if you play a contact sport, or you're playing any sport in general, and let's say, for example, you've gone to step and you've planted your foot, and then all of a sudden someone comes in to tackle you, or they apply pressure on your knee or your hip in a wrong angle, your knee pops out, or you sprain an MCL, ACL, PCL, or one of the CLs that is in your knee, but you get an injury from that actual contact incident. That's a contact injury. And for the most part, while we can, through training and through proper strength conditioning, we can lessen the likelihood of that happening, it's not preventable, because there has been an external force applied to the joint or to the injured area in a way where it's just not meant to bend. So if you could imagine, for those of you that are listening, that somebody was to come in from the side and basically put pressure on your knee to move it to the side, rather than the flexion and extension that the joint is meant to do, if you push that too far one way, it's going to injure something. The degree and the speed and the force at which that happens is going to dictate how bad the injury could be, but that's a contact injury, right? So it's important to understand with that, if contact injuries keep reoccurring, there may be an underlying issue that you can address with training. However, depending on the context at which that happens, there may be no avoiding that. At the end of the day, when it comes to injury, if you're having an active life, is probably going to be something you are going to have to deal with, whether you have the most amazing program or not. Okay, if you don't want to get injured, you just got to stay in bed all day. But at some point, that's going to have a a finite time, a very short finite timeline on it. But if you're an active person, there is going to be some risk of injury at some point. But what today is really about is because I've had a few questions come through where I keep hurting my back while I'm training. I keep hurting my shoulder while I'm training. And it's not stuff that is generally debilitating to the person. It's just this constant reoccurring, nagging injury level of pain that happens whenever they're training. So within that particular context, there are generally three areas that need to be addressed within your program if that keeps happening. And they are, number one, movement selection. So what movements are you doing? Because I think that is important and it is very much overlooked. Number two is intensity. And number three is your technique or your form. Now I'm going to dive into all three of these sections as I go through. So let's start with movement selection. So when I talk about movement selection, it doesn't mean that movement groups as a whole need to be thrown out. Let's take a squat, for example. Now, I am a massive, massive fan and advocate of a barbell back squat. I think it is something that for most people could be or should be a staple of a well-rounded program for them. Now, it doesn't need to be the main emphasis, but I think as a staple movement in most programs, it is a very good compound movement that is going to enhance your overall strength and potentially your overall level of athleticism, depending on how you're doing it. Now, depending on where you're at in your training journey, depending on your injury history, the barbell back squat itself may not actually be the best variation of the squat for you to be performing. You may be better off doing another version of the squat. And that may be something like a goblet squat. It may also be a front squat. It may be a Zercher squat. Like there are quite a number of different variations of the squat that could be selected as an alternative for the barbell back squat. It's the same as a conventional deadlift from the ground. This is something, and this is feedback that I've gotten from more people that I can count when it comes to doing deadlifts. I can't do deadlifts because it hurts my back every time I do it. Now, this may also feed into, and it has in the past when I've worked with these people, it may actually feed into the technique, the form, or the way they're doing the movement. But say, for example, some people have lever lengths, previous injuries that may prevent them from getting into a type of position that is going to be beneficial for them when they do the barbell deadlift. And when they do a barbell deadlift, because they are unable to get into a good position, especially if they're doing it from the floor, it may aggravate an injury or cause them further injury when they do it. So instead of that, there may be another alternative that you may look at doing, like an RDL or a trap bar deadlift or something along those lines, where even though an RDL and a barbell deadlift from the floor are slightly different movements, they are different emphasizes. One, you are emphasizing the concentric, one you're emphasizing the eccentric, even though you can switch those things up. It is a way where we can dictate the range of motion. It is another thing from a movement selection, and this is going to feed into point two, which is intensity, where you may play with the range of motion. So if somebody is taller, they've got longer legs. If they're doing a barbell deadlift and it always causes them issue when they do it, perhaps they need to actually raise it off the floor, do it off a platform, do it off some blocks, not where they're standing on it, where the plates are raised and the bar is raised. So they're taking that bar from a higher point in order to do it effectively and get themselves into a better position to do it. So movement selection, I think, is one of the most important things when it comes to being injury-free, and movement selection around your particular set of circumstances, because as with anything that we do, context is so very important. Your previous injury history, your training history, all these things need to, and there are a lot of variables within those, even those two areas, they need to be taken into account. And this is where running into or doing, say, a general group program can cause people some issues and constant reoccurring issues. But if we loop back to the deadlift example, where I reduce the range of motion, that's a form of intensity that I've looked at reducing in order to keep the person injury free. So that's point number 2, intensity. Now, within intensity, there are actually quite a number of, I guess, sub points that you need to look at within that. And I think intensity for a lot of people gets misconstrued, and they don't understand intensity as a whole, as I'm talking about it. They think intensity may just be speed. How fast am I doing it? How quickly am I going with this movement? Like, how much am I sweating when you do the movement? And that's not it. Intensity for me is 3 parts. It's loading, it's speed, and it's range of motion. So if we start from the bottom and work our way back up, range of motion, I've just given you an example of that within that deadlift scenario that I was talking about, where by reducing the range of motion, actually raising the plates off the floor so that the person is not taking them from the ground, because maybe they're taller, maybe they don't quite have the mobility in their hips just yet in order to take it from the floor. Some people may be able to work to get to that position. There are others that I have worked with that their lever lengths are just at a point where it's just not going to be beneficial for us to work them back to the ground. Their goals and what they're trying to achieve, the amount of time that we're going to have to put in order to get them to that point is just not sustainable. So we may just lead with a trap bar deadlift, or we may lead with just they're always going to do it where the bar's going to be in a slightly elevated position. That's reducing range of motion. And just because someone somewhere on the internet or at some point dictated that you have to do something to a particular range of motion doesn't mean it has to be done that way for everybody. And that's the same thing with a squat. Going with the crease of your hips below the top of your knee may not put you in an advantageous position. So maybe your squat range of motion for the time being, for where you're at right now, again, based off your injury history, based off your training history, may not be to or below that parallel point. It may only be what may be dictated as a quarter squat, but that's where you're able to move through a good position, maintain good posture and positioning in order to perform the movement safely and not have that risk of reoccurring injury in the gym when you're doing the movement. So range of motion is something that is sometimes overlooked or sometimes forced upon people due to an arbitrary line or an arbitrary range of motion that we have deemed needs to be achieved. Now, in saying that, your goals do need to matter. If you're training for, say, a powerlifting meet, then you need to do the work required in order to get to that range of motion. Because in that competition setting, you are going to be required to adhere to the rules of that competition, which will be that range of motion. But from the point of view of a general health and wellness standpoint, it is not required for you to do that. Do I believe that the greater range of motion you could move through, the better? Yes, I do. But some people may not be able to do that. And it is better that they start moving and start the progress rather than get too bogged down with that. So range of motion is the first thing. Speed is the second thing. So speed, how fast you're doing the movement. For a lot of beginners I have coached, we have needed to slow everything right down, because as soon as we start to do things quickly, they lose posture and position, they get themselves into a bad spot. So if we start adding load to a movement that they are doing fast, it is going to be a recipe for disaster, and those injuries are going to keep reoccurring. So slowing things down can be another form of intensity that needs to be addressed. Now, it could be written into a program as tempo, but for me, tempo is actually a more advanced programming technique to get a different stimulus out of the person you are coaching in order to drive a different adaptation. When I'm talking about speed in this standpoint, I'm talking about control, slowing it down to the point where you have full control of the movement through the full range of motion. So speed is another thing. And then loading. So when I talk about loading, I'm actually talking about two things. I'm talking about the weight on the bar. So when our ego gets in the road when we're lifting, and especially if we're lifting with friends, we're lifting in a group, we're going to want to keep up. We're going to want to show off a little bit, especially as males. That's that alpha type thing that some people want to be. Like, they want to be the strongest person in the room. But if you lift more than what your capacity is and what your form and your technique and your movement selection will allow you to, or your movement proficiency will allow you to, you do run the risk of injury. Now, in order to get stronger, you need to push the boundaries. So the weight needs to go up, but it needs to be done in a measured way. It needs to be done for me, especially for a beginner, it needs to be done in a very incremental, measured way so that if something does go wrong, we know the exact point at which it has gone wrong, and we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater and having to start everything from scratch. We can readjust and reset to the point where we know there is no issue. But if we've just taken big jumps and we've gone too heavy all the time, we might get away with it for a little bit. But then when something goes wrong, we're not exactly sure where it went wrong. So we don't know how to readjust our program or readjust our approach because we've gone from A to F and we don't know whether it's B, C, D, or E is the point where it's gone wrong. It may actually be that it's E where it's gone wrong. So we just have to dial it back and work from A to E. But if we've just gone from A to F with our weight, with our reps, with anything that we throw in, if we've taken that big incremental jump as a beginner, as an advanced athlete, you may be able to do that because you have an inherent understanding of your own limits, which is something that comes from building that consistency. But if we go from A to F as a beginner and then something goes wrong at F, we have to go back to A because we don't know at which point it went wrong. Whereas if we just went A to B and everything was fine there, then B to C, then C to D, and then let's say something went wrong at D, then we've still actually got more range of motion, more range we can work towards within the program because we know there's 3 steps that we'll find. So that's where the weight and also the repetitions, big chunks of reps, really working and big jumps in reps as we're starting to build that capacity, we're starting to build our consistency. Because at the end of the day, that's what it all comes down to, building consistency and trying to stay in the gym for longer and being consistent with our actions. And that's what injury prevents us from doing. But the weight and the repetitions from a loading point of view, both of those equate to the overall training load of the program. So understanding those and understanding maybe we're doing too much right now for our current capacity, again, based off our previous injuries history, based off our previous training history, if those aren't right, they have the potential to cause injury. And this is where most people will go to as step one. But the reason I'm doing this is because sometimes it's actually not those things. Sometimes it's not the weight and repetition. Sometimes it's movement selection. Sometimes it's the speed of the movement, the range of motion of the movement, or it may be the technique at which you're doing the movement. Now, as you get heavier and as you get more weight and as you get more fatigued, technique does start to break down. So all of these 3 things are intertwined. Yes, from time to time when I've been coaching people, it is the actual physical technique of the movement. In fact, sometimes if they have a movement where they've got, I can't do that movement, and we spend a little bit of time just tweaking the technique and tweaking their position, sometimes they can do the movement. And sometimes it is as simple as just getting their hips in the right position, getting their stance set properly, getting them to understand proper bracing as they're doing the movement, and they're good to go. And the intensity and the movement selection don't actually need to be addressed immediately. They may need to be addressed further down the line, but immediately they do not. So sometimes it's a technique thing. But if we actually look at the training program as a whole, I would say if you've had your it's almost like a checklist, right? So if things keep reoccurring and an injury keeps reoccurring, if you know your technique is okay, you can tick that box. Okay, so it's got to be one of the other two things. Is it movement selection? Is maybe this movement not right for me right now? And I would say if your technique is okay with it, it is probably okay for you. That movement is probably okay for you right now. Maybe. Again, very context specific, but for the most part, what I've come across, if your technique is okay, the movement is probably okay. Then it is something within that intensity piece that needs to be looked at. Is it the loading? So is it the weight that we're using or the repetitions that we're working towards? Where is it breaking down at that point, especially if it means that it's only breaking down at a heavier weight? Okay, and what is our current capacity to do that particular movement? If it's not, maybe we need to exhibit more control through the movement. So what's the speed like, and what's your range of motion like? Range of motion, and these all kind of intertwine, right? As I'm sure you can pick up. Range of motion is kind of falls into the technique and form category. Like, maybe you have really good technique on a squat when you're working to above parallel, but then as soon as you push your hips below the crease of your knee, it looks like, a dog shitting a razor blade. So that kind of feeds into, so your technique and your range of motion. For now, if you want to do the movement safely, maybe you're doing a box squat, maybe you're doing, and again, now I'm talking about movement selection. So it's a different variation of the movement. Maybe a front squat is better for you. It allows you to keep a nice upright torso. Yes, there's different muscles that get worked with that, but it's still a squat. So hopefully that gives you some idea from a very broad overview. I went pretty deep on that, and to be honest, I could go a lot deeper on those three sections and addressing things within your program and within the way you do your program if you are consistently finding you're getting injured with it. Just know, and if I'm going to finish it off with one thing, if you are consistently getting the same injury over and over again, and it is not a contact injury, it is not from something that you are doing that is contact outside of, you're doing jiu-jitsu, still playing contact football or whatever the case might be. If you are consistently getting injured in the gym in a controlled environment, then something needs to be addressed. I can't stress that enough. And what I would be doing is I would be seeking help, if you're at that point, from somebody who knows what they're doing, who knows what they're looking at from a higher level, whether it be a physio, exercise physiologist, or whatever the case might be, to work out what the underlying issue is within your program, and then also within potentially your biomechanics, muscular imbalances, things like that, to stop yourself getting hurt, because there is nothing worse than getting injured and having the same injury reoccur over and over and over again. It stops you from building the number one thing that you need to be focusing on when you are looking to get your strength back, when you are looking to become the fittest version and best and the healthiest version of yourself. And that is building your consistency. So injury, for the most part, will be unavoidable. It will happen at some point. But if it keeps happening from doing the same thing over and over and over again, well, isn't that the definition of insanity? So I'll leave it there. recap, 3 things that you may need to look at if you are constantly having recurring injuries happen from training. Movement selection, intensity. Intensity can be loading, it can be repetitions, it can be weight, it can be speed, and it can be range of motion. And also, and the go-to can also be your technique or your form. If you need help with that, I have a link in the show notes where you can book in a time to have a chat with me. We can talk all things training, your program. If that's something you're struggling with, I am here to help. I'll even get you to send me through some videos of any movements that are causing you issues so I can have a look from there. But if you need help, if you want a program, I'm your guy. I've been doing it now for the last 15 years and I love doing it. And I would love to help you. So you can book in a time, book in a call, using the link in the show notes, or reach out and send us a message on the socials. So a little bit longer episode today. Thanks for sticking with me. Like, share, subscribe. Have a great week, and I will talk to you next week. Goodbye.